Good morning. This morning's scripture reading is going to be Psalm 37, verses 5 through 7. If you're using the Pewback Bible, it is on page 449. The Pewback Bible. It's the Bible in the Pewback. Psalm 37, 5 through 7, the NIV version. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes.
Well, good morning. It is good to see you all. I hope that everyone has been having a good weekend, a good week, and I hope that you've been blessed this morning. I appreciate Jim's quality song leading for us. I enjoyed a lot of these songs. They were some of the more formative for me when I was deciding to be a Christian myself. I'm grateful for those quality classes and communion comments. I feel edified this morning, and I hope that you do too as we kind of gather to worship God. So this is officially our halfway point in our series on the book of Exodus. And just a small reminder why we're doing this. I didn't just pick this out of a hat. But we're studying the book of Exodus because this is what our young people are studying. Our 3rd through 12th graders have been working since October to study the book of Exodus. At the very beginning of March, they're going to be doing a Bible Bowl on Exodus. And at the very end of March, they're going to be doing LTC on the same thing. And so I wanted us as a church family to come alongside them in their study and their work so that we as a larger congregation could study the same spirit-filled scriptures that they are. You might remember that back in the day, we used to take a Sunday night around this time and do a buzzer, like Family Feud buzzer-style trivia on the book that they were studying with our young people, right? And we don't really have a Sunday night gathering right now, so I know that the Beaver Creek small group is actually joining the teenager small group tonight, the youth group small group, so we could do that same thing. So if you want to join us, I guess you're welcome to. We do it to build confidence for the young people when they can simply beat the old people. The young people can be confident, or we beat them and shame them into more studying before Bible Bowl happens. I'm not sure exactly which it'll be this year. I haven't been a part of any practices yet, but it's a good time. So last week we worked through 3 lessons on the plagues, right? In fact, later in the week, Jim, I appreciate, sent me a meme that summed it up really well. And in fact, last week, I think, Andy, you mentioned the Change My Mind meme. You remember that from community comments? Well, this is the Change My Mind meme. It says, I will not let your people go, change my mind. And then God sent a bunch of frogs. I just want this congregation to know that biblical and sermon-based memes are always welcomed here at the Centerville Church of Christ. But as we know and as we talked about, the Pharaoh did not change his mind by the frogs or the flies, by the darkness or the hail. 9 plagues crossed Pharaoh's path, and still there was no repentance. There was no willingness to obey God whatsoever. And so, in chapter 11, Moses introduces to Pharaoh what would be the 10th and the final plague. And we pick up on that in chapter 11. We'll skip ahead to verse 4 for the sake of time. So Moses said, "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. From the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you.' After that, I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. So this is the 10th plague, and we mentioned that Tristan was baptized last Tuesday. And in fact, in a little bit of time and study, I think with his small group, we talked about the 9 plagues, and he asked what the 10th plague was, and it really caught him off guard to hear what the 10th plague was. This is by far the most difficult piece of the book of Exodus, if you ask me. Even for me as the preacher here, I read through this passage, I reflect on these thoughts, and they bother me. They're hard for me to always understand. They don't match our modern sensibilities. They hurt to even read and hear. And of course, there are explanations that we could look at about this plague, about this disaster that happened all those years ago. We could talk about how it's an eye for eye kind of verdict against the Egyptians, who killed more than just the firstborn sons, right? They spent who knows how long killing all the sons born to any of the Hebrew slaves. Or we could talk about how these deaths were probably much less than the number of deaths that more years of oppression and slavery put upon the Israelites would have upheld, right? That it's a utilitarian view, that these deaths don't equal the amount of deaths that would happen under that oppression of slavery. Or we could talk about how God's grace covers the deaths of innocents who are lost too young, right? There are things we could say about this passage. There are explanations we could give. But I think it's okay to take a moment and simply feel the sadness and the weight of the devastation that sin brings, right? You know, let's not have to jump to excuses. Let's not jump to explanations, though there are some, and there are things that I think are helpful to us to understand. It's important to sometimes just stop and accept that something like this is awful, that it's sad, that it's hard to deal with, because this is what sin brings about. We read here at the end of verse 8 that Moses, after he finished declaring this to Pharaoh, that he was hot with anger when he left Pharaoh. And I think that hotness of anger is not just, being mad at Pharaoh for not listening or this, that, and the other. I think Moses is upset because he knows what is about to happen. That he looks at Pharaoh. He looks at this man who is choosing stubbornness and pride and selfishness. And he sees what that one man's decisions is about to bring so much pain and devastation on so many other people, right? Moses was mad to see how someone could choose to allow death and suffering to happen again, right? For the 10th time. Instead of allowing people to have what? Freedom? Let them have life and happiness and freedom? That's what he is refusing to let happen? That's what he is choosing instead? And we know, beyond Moses being angry, we know from various scriptures that God, his heart breaks on these kind of things. Even when he's the one who has to deal out the judgments, God's heart does not take any joy in punishing the wicked, let alone the innocents who are caught up in the wicked's decisions, right? It's absolutely something that we should mourn over, that should touch us, that should prick our hearts. And yet, I also want to point out that this is nothing unique to this story, right? This is not unique to the 10th plague in the book of Exodus in the Bible. Throughout time and across the globe, kids have suffered and died for arrogant, sinful decisions of adults, right? Across time and across the globe, kids have and do suffer because of adults' poor decisions. Just look at what's happening in Palestine and Israel right now, right? Depending what algorithm you're on, you probably hear about kids suffering and dying on both sides. It's awful. And we could talk about everything from bombings on innocent cities and world wars to starving children because of sanctions across the globe. And there's obviously even less dramatic things than that. But kids suffer because of the sinful, broken decisions of adults, don't they? And that's not right, and that's not okay. That is part of what it means to live in a broken and sinful world. It's nothing specific to Exodus 11 and 12. It's something that we see every single day. But I think the grace of God here is in his effort to rescue the firstborn children of the Israelites, okay? Too many times we get caught up on the punishment, on the judgment for the Egyptians, and we forget that bigger here is the grace of God that rescues the firstborn of the Israelites. He gives his people an opportunity for atonement. Because the Israelites, they have guilt too, right? I mean, I know in this story that they are the oppressed, that they are the ones who God is working to rescue and to bring to new life. And yet we know from Romans chapter 3 that nobody is without guilt, right? That nobody is without sin, and that the consequences of sin is death. But God comes in here and he provides them with a substitute, with a lamb that could take the punishment of death as an atonement for them on that dreadful night of Passover. The blood of lambs that they would kill and then they would smear across the sides and the tops of their door frames would show that those wages of sin that death has already been paid for in this household, and God would pass over that house, right? He would pass over that house. And this is the story that our Jewish friends gather together to tell year after year after year when they gather at the Passover, which really is only a handful of weeks away here. And I think that's actually what I want us to spend most of our time on this morning. I want to address the hardship here, especially with young Christians in the room. Like, let's talk about how difficult some of this is. But what I want to spend most of our time focusing on this morning is this. The whole story, which is at this climactic moment, right? We've gone through 9 plagues. We're here looking at the 10th plague. We're right before the actual exodus of Egypt. This whole story, which is at this climactic moment, comes to a hard pause, as God, through Moses, gives these specific instructions on how this ritual of Passover should go, right? Isn't that interesting? Maybe the author is trying to build some suspense here by holding out that 10th and final plague, but it's very odd for what has been such a fast-paced story through the plagues to stop it right before it gets to that central moment. And more than just the tempo is also the real estate here in the book, okay? The actual historical event of God coming into Egypt, of the passing of the firstborns and the passing over of the Israelites, that whole actual historical event is 2 verses. It's chapter 12, verse 9 and 29 and 30, and then it's over, okay? But the ritual of Passover, implementing this new celebration that they would participate in on this night and how it would last for generations to come, that's like 30-something verses. 2 verses compared to 30-something verses. So I think it's important that we pay attention to this practice of Passover and what it is and what it means. And so we won't read all 30-something verses, but we'll look at maybe the first 8 here in chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year." Kind of this idea that it's resetting their whole calendar, that their whole future will be redefined and reallocated from this very moment, that they're entering into a new chapter, a new era. Verse 3, "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month," which I always thought was kind of rough. They're doing this on the 10th day, right? So on the 14th day, they've been taken care of and cuddling around this little lamb. And you kind of know what happens next, all right? Kind of feel the weight of that sacrifice, though, right? "Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and the tops of the doorframes of the houses where they eat the lamb. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." All right, so this is that Passover moment. This is what they were supposed to partake in, to join in being passed over in this judgment moment. But like the poet from Ecclesiastes kind of mentions, there's a time for feasting, right? There's a time for feasting, there's a time for celebration, and there's a time to cease from feasting, okay? And in this moment, on this Passover night, it does not seem like the time for feasting, right? The Israelites here, when they're hearing this from Moses, when they're being told to do this, when they're being told to take a lamb and sacrifice it and roast it and eat this, what would have been a very hearty, a very like above average meal, on that night, they are still slaves, right? They are still slaves. They go to bed that night, and Pharaoh has refused their freedom over and over and over again. And yet God wants them to partake in what would be this above average celebratory meal of a roasted lamb. It almost doesn't make any sense. It almost feels like God mixed it up a little bit, like somebody would come to God and say, "You know, God, I don't want to embarrass you here, but celebrations are for on the other side. Celebrations are for the other side of victory. As of right now, we're slaves. We ain't got nothing to celebrate, all right? Pharaoh said no. We've had a lot of frogs in our bed too. You don't forget, I know the last couple plagues, it's just been them, but we had frogs in our beds. We are still slaves. Pharaoh has said no. Why should I take of this kind of a feast of a meal, right? And yet God does invite them to sit at a feast even while they're still in their chains. And the feast itself, it's conducted in this kind of expectant way, right? The bread is supposed to be unleavened because it won't have time to rise. There shouldn't be any leftovers because they're not going to be around to eat the leftovers. They're supposed to eat this meal with their shoes on their feet, their coat on their back, and their staff in their hand, right? In anticipation of God doing what he's always said he would do, in anticipation of being on that road to freedom in just a few hours. So yeah, they were still slaves that night. But God wanted them to have such an assurance of their salvation that they could celebrate it ahead of time. Do you hear that? They were still slaves that night, but God wanted them to have such an assurance of their salvation that they could celebrate it ahead of time. And something I really want us to see. God regularly invites his people to celebrate his victories before they ever happen. God's promises are so sure, they are so guaranteed that we might as well start partying now. Okay, that's the way to put it. His promises are so sure that we might as well just party now. I know our world will say, don't count your chickens before they hatch, right? But with God, you might as well buy an omelet pan because you can be sure it's going to happen. You know, none of his promises have ever or will ever fail. You know, and that's why James can tell us, this was actually mentioned this morning, that's why James can tell us to consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind. James can look at that trial and tell you to consider it joy because he knows that God will use it to our growth because God has promised that. It's why Peter can say that it's better to suffer for doing good than to do evil because God will be the vindicator. And ultimately, it's the reason that you and I can look the grave in the face and say, oh, death, where is your sting? Right? 1 Corinthians 15. Death, you have no more power because my God has promised a resurrection. You know, that is our truth. That is our joy. The fact that we can look at this world and not have to see what's right before us. But we can celebrate knowing that God will win the victory, right? We can celebrate knowing in advance that God is faithful. And that's what the Christian hope is. This is what has defined Christian character for centuries now. Living out your future hope today instead of wallowing in our current pains. We're not defined by what happens to us right now or the world we live in right now because we can sit down to a feast ahead of time knowing what God is going to do. And that's kind of one of the questions for your small group tonight. It's the Super Bowl, so I'll give it to you early so you can have your answer ready for your small group, right? And that's the idea of how can we live with this shoes-on kind of expectancy, right? You know, the Israelites, at the Passover, they ate that meal with their shoes on, expecting the freedom that God had promised them, expecting that in a matter of moments, they would be on the move towards freedom because God had told them so. You know, what's our version of that? What's our version of living in this life with our shoes on because God has made promises that we know and trust and believe will happen? There's a variety of answers, right? But I think one of them is the fact that you can talk to your friends, you can talk to your coworkers about your faith because you actually believe that all of us will stand in judgment, right? You know that one day we will stand before God and account for all that we've done. And because that is true, you don't need to be embarrassed about sharing your faith with your friends or coworkers today. Or is it like what Peter said, being willing to suffer for doing right because you know that God will vindicate that suffering? Or is it not buckling your seatbelt because you think God's got you? Not that I'm recommending that, Bob, okay? But this is the whole point. This is why we want to have these discussions. There are ideas that kind of sound like that are probably not the best ideas, okay? But there are other ways to contemplate this and work on this. And I'm not just going to give you the right answers. I'm going to give you wrong answers and make you try to figure that out sometimes too, right? But how can we live with a shoes-on kind of expectancy? And one way that I really think that we do this on a regular basis is when we sit around the Lord's Supper table each week, right? Well, I know we took the whole month of August last year to talk about the Lord's Supper. And I know that many of you shared with me that was helpful and informative. But I want to bring us back to that for a little bit. In communion, we come to this table to eat of a meal alongside each other in the presence of God in a way that anticipates that future heavenly banquet, right? It anticipates that future heavenly banquet. Now, on this side of life, we don't get to see God face to face, do we? We don't get to see God with our eyes. On this side of life, we don't always get along with our church brothers and sisters, do we? Not all the time, right? On this side of life, there are people who don't have easy access to food and to drink, that there's no banquet at their tables, right? That's the truth of the world we live in right now. But once a week, at this table, we sit down expectantly, tasting of the promises of God that we fully believe will come true one day, where we will be with God face to face with no distance, no gap, no hindrances, where I will sit next to my saved brothers and sisters without a care in the world of our differences or our past grievances, where we will have all that we would ever need to sustain us, right? That's the future that I believe in. That's the future I hope you believe in. And every week we defy the world we live in when we sit at this table and feast in expectancy of what will come, what God has promised us will be in perfect unity forever. So it's only appropriate, I think, that Jesus instituted this Lord's Supper during a Passover celebration. I know a lot of you probably know that. Some of you might not have. But he instituted it over a Passover celebration years later. Because here's the thing. Passover is a feast for pilgrims, okay? It's a feast for pilgrims. Like we said, it was a meal eaten with your shoes on and your coat on and your staff in your hand for a people who were going to be traveling, right? There wasn't even time for leaven in the bread. There wasn't time for leftovers. There wasn't time for anything else. It was to be eaten ready to move and ready to follow God. They ate it in haste. They ate it as a feast for pilgrims. They ate it planning on being moved by God from a land of slavery to a land of beauty, right? From a land of scarcity and oppression to a land of abundance and comfort. That's what they believed. They ate that meal as pilgrims between a land of pain and a land of hope. And I think the same thing is true for the Lord's Supper, right? This communion that we just took in not too long ago, that is a feast for pilgrims, that we eat and drink at this table as pilgrims, don't we? Right? We're moving from our old selves to a new creation. We're moving from our old home to a new promised land, a land of exile to a home in glorious heaven. And we eat and we drink here as pilgrims, expecting and willing to journey with God. You know, this is not a meal for the stationary, okay? This is not a meal for those who are already happy with where they are. This is not a meal for people who think this world is fine and dandy and they would rather keep it where they are. This is not a meal for those who have given up already and aren't willing to move anymore. You know, the very nature of the Lord's Supper points us to a new destination and calls us to grow and move on our journey with God, right? That's what this is. That's what this does. So like our spiritual ancestors, we participate in a feast for pilgrims as we're on the move closer and closer to our great and wonderful home. Because like those ancient Israelites, God has saved us, right? God has stamped our hearts. He has stamped our souls with a promise for a new destination. Jesus and his disciples, they sat around a Passover meal centuries ago, eating roast lamb, eating unleavened bread, taking of the fruit of the cup, recounting the story of how God had freed the Israelites from slavery and spared them the deaths of their sons, spared them from death and slavery to freedom. And Jesus and his disciples, they worshiped God throughout that feast. And of course, later, the next morning, Jesus himself would follow in the same path of those Passover lambs, right? He would become the ultimate Passover lamb. He would die in our place so that any of us who are washed in his blood might be saved from eternal death and instead receive freedom with God. And just like those Israelites, we are given this regular reminder to partake and to remember God's mighty acts of salvation for us, right? This is what it's about. He has put before us, He's invited us to the table to celebrate, even when your marriage is falling apart, even when the bill companies start calling, even when you get fired from work, even when you doubt, even when the diagnosis from the doctor is positive, even while all that is happening, God has said, hey, I've set a feast for you here. I've given you a family of union. I've given you hope for tomorrow. There is a victory coming. I know you don't see it now. I know you're still in chains, per se. But the battle is already won. And I want you to be able to keep your shoes on, keep your coat on, because you're on the move. You're not going to stay in this spot forever. You will get to a place where those tears will only be a faint, distant memory. And there will be no more tears, no more suffering, and no more crying. And that's our hope for this morning. I had extra notes. I wanted to make comments about liturgy, about the idea that God gives us these things to help us remember, that we pass it on to our next generation. But Jared did that in class this morning, and it was great. And I just want us to sit here and remember this. I'm going to skip ahead, actually, to some of this. I think that's actually the last. I don't have another slide. But this idea that we are pilgrims and that we can feast where we are, knowing that we will reach our destination. So let us gather, let us eat, let us drink, let us celebrate, remembering what God has done and what He is still doing and what He will one day do for us. If we can help you in any way this morning, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.